Does banning something actually stop it? Hap. Or does it make it more powerful? Prohibition economics shows us that government doesn't erase demand. It redirects it into criminal empires history was never meant to reveal. This is how government creates crime through unintended consequences. Al Capone economics wasn't madness, it was a business response. Organized crime capitalism thrives where regulation removes competition. That's where money laundering origins quietly enter Wall Street. This is the political economy of crime no one wants explained. From Wall Street corruption to regulatory capture finance. This system didn't fail. It evolved. And you're inside it.
Does a law written on a piece of paper really have the power to erase a human desire? In 1920, the United States tried exactly that. Overnight, alcohol became illegal. Not regulated, not taxed. Illegal. And within a few years, the country didn't become sober. It became violent. Chicago alone saw murder rates explode, criminal empires rise, and fortunes built on blood-soaked cash. So here's the real question, one they never taught you in school. When the government bans something people still want, where does that demand go? Does it disappear? Or does it retreat underground, angrier, more dangerous, and infinitely more profitable? Because this single mistake is the spark that ignited the most ruthless business model in modern history. Welcome to the dark side of financial history. Today, we're not here for romantic gangster stories or old black and white photos of men in fedoras. We're here to dissect something far more uncomfortable, the political economy of crime. We're going to strip away morality, ignore Hollywood myths, and look only at the cold mechanical math of supply and demand. What you're about to see will fundamentally change how you understand organized crime and who is actually responsible for creating it. There is a mechanism at work here, one that almost no one talks about. I call it the paradox of illegal profit. It explains why banning a product doesn't destroy a market, it perfects it. It makes that product more available, more concentrated, more dangerous, and unbelievably lucrative. Think about how a normal, legal market works. Businesses compete. Prices are driven down. Margins are thin. Efficiency matters. Innovation matters. Now imagine what happens when the government suddenly outlaws that entire industry. The honest players, the ones who follow the rules, pay taxes and fear prison, leave immediately. They shut their doors. They disappear. But the demand? The demand doesn't move an inch. In fact, it gets stronger. Human desire doesn't vanish just because a politician signs a document. If anything, being told you can't have this makes people want it more. That's not criminal psychology, that's human nature. So now the market is empty, except for one type of entrepreneur. By banning a product, the state doesn't eliminate competition. It eliminates lawful competition. And in doing so, it hands the entire market to those willing to risk prison, violence, and death. This creates something extraordinary, a massive risk premium. Prices skyrocket, not because the product is harder to make, but because the cost of doing business now includes bribes, lawyers, and bullets. Overnight, modest profits become astronomical. And here's where things get even darker. As law enforcement intensifies, the product itself changes. This is known as the iron law of prohibition. The harsher the crackdown, the stronger and more dangerous the product becomes. Why smuggle truckloads of low-value goods when you can move smaller, more concentrated versions worth 10 times as much? The law doesn't reduce harm. It incentivizes efficiency and destruction. What the government unknowingly creates is a protected monopoly, an exclusive franchise enforced not by contracts, but by violence, a version of capitalism where the barrier to entry is so high that only the most ruthless actors can survive. This isn't a failure of crime control. This is the state acting as an unwitting venture capitalist for the gangster. And if you've ever wondered why the war on anything, drugs, alcohol, vice, always seems to produce more of that thing, stay with me. Because the illegal money flooding the streets couldn't stay there forever. It needed structure, it needed logistics, it needed legitimacy. Before a street thug could become untouchable, before he could shake hands with bankers and politicians, he had to stop thinking like a criminal and start thinking like a CEO. And no one mastered that transformation better than the man we're about to talk about next. If that last realization made you slightly uncomfortable, that's a good sign. Because it means you've just crossed an invisible line, the moment where the story stops being about criminals and starts being about incentives, about systems, about power. And once you see that, it becomes very hard to unsee it. This idea that the government doesn't just fail to stop organized crime, but actively creates the perfect conditions for it, challenges almost everything we're taught about law, order, and morality. It forces a dangerous question into the open. When a regulation is passed, who actually benefits from it? And I want to pause here for just a second, not to break the flow, but to anchor you into this investigation. If this way of looking at history resonates with you, if you've ever watched a new law get passed and wondered whether it was really designed to protect the public or to protect someone else, I want you to be part of this conversation. Drop a comment. Agreement isn't required. Curiosity is. Because this channel exists for people who don't settle for surface-level explanations, and content like this doesn't survive unless there are people on the other side who are willing to engage with uncomfortable ideas. Now let's be honest about something most creators won't say out loud. The systems that decide what videos get seen don't love this kind of analysis. Unfiltered financial history, power structures, incentives that point the finger upward. So when you interact, when you like, comment, or subscribe, you're not just helping a channel. You're signaling that this kind of thinking deserves oxygen. If you want to keep uncovering the mechanics that connect crime, finance, and political power, stories that rarely make it into textbooks, make sure you're subscribed. Because everything we're doing here builds on one central idea. Once you understand the system, you stop being surprised by its outcomes. And with that foundation in place, it's time to move from theory to reality. Because the economic machine we just described didn't run itself. Once Prohibition created the market, it needed someone with vision to organize the chaos. Someone who understood that this new world wasn't won by the fastest gun, but by logistics, payroll, and consolidation. This wasn't about being the most violent thug on the street. It was about realizing that violence wasn't personal. It was operational. A cost to be managed. A tool to enforce contracts in a world where the courts had been removed. The system was ready. The incentives were aligned. All that was missing was the man who understood that organized crime wasn't really about crime at all. It was about management. And that's where our story truly begins. To understand Al Capone, we have to do something uncomfortable. We have to stop seeing him as a cartoon villain. Forget the scar. Forget the fedora. Forget the Hollywood version of the gangster who shoots first and thinks later. That image is comforting because it makes the problem feel distant, primitive, and solved. The real Al Capone was far more dangerous than that. Because Al Capone wasn't a monster. He was a business solution. He didn't emerge because he was uniquely evil. He emerged because the system demanded someone exactly like him. In economic terms, Capone wasn't an anomaly. He was an inevitability. A perfectly rational response to a distorted market created by Prohibition. If you strip away the guns and the violence, what you're left with is something deeply unsettling. Al Capone was the CEO of a massive, vertically integrated, multinational enterprise. The only difference between his organization and a Fortune 500 company was the regulatory environment. And that's where the story gets uncomfortable. When we think about gangsters, we imagine chaos, drive-by shootings, bar fights, random brutality. But chaos is bad for business. Capone understood something fundamental. Violence isn't the goal, stability is. His real job wasn't pulling triggers, it was managing logistics under extreme pressure. Think about the scale of what that meant in the 1920s. Capone wasn't just selling alcohol. He was importing Canadian whiskey across frozen borders, rum from the Caribbean through corrupt ports, and overseeing beer production in hundreds of hidden breweries scattered across Chicago. Every bottle had to be sourced, transported, stored, protected, and delivered. That required trucks, warehouses, drivers, accountants, schedules, redundancy plans. And unlike a legal business, every single link in that supply chain was under constant threat. In a normal company, if a shipment is delayed, you call a lawyer, an insurer, or a mechanic. In Capone's world, a delayed shipment could mean losing territory or starting a war. Every logistical failure was an invitation for a rival to move in. This is where the true transformation happens. To keep this machine running, Capone had to solve a problem most people never consider. How do you enforce contracts in a world where the law refuses to protect you? In the legal economy, we outsource violence to the state. If someone cheats you, the courts step in. The government provides contract enforcement as a public service. It creates predictability. It makes commerce possible. Prohibition erased that protection overnight. The deals didn't stop. The money didn't stop. The disputes didn't stop. But the courts were gone. So Capone replaced them. This is the moment where our understanding flips upside down. The Thompson submachine gun wasn't a symbol of madness. It was a tool of litigation. In the black market economy, violence becomes the substitute for the judicial system. It is how property rights are enforced when the state steps away. Capone didn't maintain an army of soldiers because he loved bloodshed. He maintained it because without credible enforcement, his entire business collapsed. His security budget was enormous, but it was no different in principle from a corporation's legal department or compliance division. Violence wasn't emotional, it was procedural. And once you see it this way, the events of the Roaring Twenties stop looking random. Take the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Popular culture frames it as senseless brutality. In reality, it was a hostile takeover. A calculated corporate maneuver designed to eliminate a competitor and consolidate market share. The same goal pursued by monopolies throughout legitimate history, just with different tools. Capone understood something every capitalist eventually learns. Competition is expensive. Competition drives down prices, increases risk, and eats into margins. The endgame isn't rivalry, it's control. Monopoly brings stability. By eliminating rivals, Capone could control supply, fix prices, and ultimately reduce the overall level of violence required to maintain order. Paradoxically, fewer competitors meant fewer wars. It was brutal, but it was efficient. And here's the part that truly reframes everything. To run an empire of this scale, Capone couldn't operate entirely in the shadows. Guns alone don't create power. Legitimacy does. So he didn't just fight the system, he absorbed it. Police captains, judges, politicians, journalists, everyone had a price, and in the 1920s it was surprisingly affordable. Capone embedded his operation into the city's institutions. This wasn't just bribery, it was brand management. He opened soup kitchens during the Great Depression. He tipped extravagantly. He cultivated a public image as a provider, a man supplying what the people wanted but the government denied them. To many, he wasn't a criminal. He was a workaround. And this leads us to the most important realization of all. Al Capone wasn't the disease. He was the symptom, a symptom of a market warped by policy, where outlawing a commodity didn't eliminate it. It eliminated the rule of law. But success created a new problem. Capone's empire generated so much cash that it became physically unmanageable. Mountains of small bills pouring in from speakeasies and gambling dens. You can't store that kind of money forever. It attracts thieves. It attracts attention. To ascend from wealthy criminal to untouchable elite, the money had to change form. It had to be cleaned. And solving that problem would connect the dirty streets of Chicago to the polished halls of global finance, forever. Because the moment the gangster needs the banker, the game changes entirely. We need to stop for a moment and visualize the real problem Al Capone was facing. Not morally, not legally, physically. Today, wealth is invisible. It's a number on a screen, moving across borders in milliseconds. But in the 1920s, money was paper. It was heavy. It was bulky. It smelled like smoke, sweat, and cheap alcohol. Imagine rooms stacked floor to ceiling with small bills, $5 notes soaked in beer and blood. This wasn't just profit. It was a liability. Cash that sits still is dead. It earns nothing. It attracts thieves. And worst of all, it attracts attention. For the first time in history, organized crime didn't face a violence problem. It faced a logistics problem. Making the money was easy. Using it was the hard part. And this single constraint forced a transformation that would permanently alter the global financial system. This is the moment crime evolved. Capone and his peers realized something fundamental. If their money remained illegal in form, they would remain criminals forever. Power doesn't come from cash alone. Power comes from legitimacy, from access, from invisibility. The money had to change its appearance. It had to be reborn. This is where the term money laundering is born. And for once, the name is not a metaphor. It was literal. Gangsters began buying businesses that shared one crucial feature. They dealt almost entirely in cash. Car washes, bakeries, bars, and most famously, laundromats. Why laundromats? Because there was no way to audit reality. You can't count how many shirts were washed. You can't prove how many coins went into the machines. If a laundromat legitimately made $1,000 a week, Capone's accountants could claim it made $5. Dirty money from speakeasies was mixed with clean business revenue. Taxes were paid on the total. And suddenly the blood vanished from the balance sheet. The government was satisfied. The taxes were paid. The gangster was satisfied. The money was now usable. And with that transaction, something irreversible happened. Crime didn't hide from the system anymore. It merged with it. The laundromat wasn't the breakthrough. It was just the prototype, the training wheels. The real transformation came when organized crime realized it didn't need fake businesses forever. What it needed were professionals, people who spoke the language of legitimacy. This is the moment when the street hired the suit. Gangsters didn't understand shell companies. They didn't know trusts, holding structures, offshore jurisdictions, or accounting opacity. But the lawyers did. The accountants did. The bankers absolutely did. And they made a choice. This is the hidden truth. Most financial history books politely skip over. Organized crime could never scale without the willing participation of the white-collar class. The violence generated the cash. The professionals made it invisible. A banker knows when numbers don't make sense. He knows a small bakery doesn't deposit $50,000 in cash every Friday. But he also knows his bank needs liquidity. Deposits become loans. Loans become bonuses. Bonuses become careers. So he doesn't ask questions. The bank becomes the washing machine. Street violence feeds liquidity. Liquidity feeds credit builds skyscrapers. This is not corruption at the margins. This is a symbiotic system. The predator feeds the host, and the host protects the predator. This is where money laundering becomes more than a trick. It becomes an architecture. Placement, layering, integration. First, the dangerous moment, getting the cash into the system. Then, the maze, moving it through shells, assets, jurisdictions, transactions designed to exhaust any investigator. And finally, integration, the victory lap. The money re-enters society as real estate, art, corporate shares, philanthropy. At this stage, the gangster no longer looks like a criminal. He looks like a pillar of the community. And here's the uncomfortable part. Once the money is integrated, no one wants to pull the thread, because pulling it would unravel banks, markets, portfolios, and pensions. The crime is no longer external to the system. It has been absorbed. This is how violence gets socialized. The profits extracted through fear and blood don't disappear. They inflate asset prices. They distort markets. They stabilize banks during crises. There were moments, especially during the 2008 collapse, when illicit capital was among the only liquid funds keeping parts of the system alive. Crime didn't weaken finance. In some cases, it propped it up. This is why Prohibition wasn't just a failed social experiment. It was the beta test for the modern financial underworld. The shell companies, the fronts, the nominee directors, the offshore structures. These weren't invented by hedge funds. They were perfected by criminals who needed to survive. The line between underworld and overworld didn't blur. It disappeared. The gangster learned he didn't need to rob the bank. He just needed to own it. And once crime learned how to wear a suit, there was no going back. Because money that looks clean can buy laws. And laws can protect monopolies. And that's where this story is heading next. Because hiding money was only the beginning. The real power came when criminal logic reshaped entire organizations, and when the structure of the mafia started to look disturbingly familiar to the structure of Wall Street itself. Block 005. Take a step back for a moment, because what you're about to see only becomes obvious when you stop looking at names and start looking at shapes. I want you to visualize two organizational charts side by side. On the left, the hierarchy of a traditional mafia family. On the right, the structure of a too-big-to-fail investment bank. Now erase the labels. Remove the Italian names. Remove the corporate titles. What you're left with is unsettling. The geometry is identical. This isn't coincidence. It's not poetic metaphor. It's the unavoidable architecture of concentrated power. At the top of the mafia hierarchy sits the boss, the capo di tutti I capi. He sets the vision, settles disputes, and decides who rises and who disappears. On Wall Street, we call him the CEO. Different language, same function. Keep the money flowing upward and the structure intact. Directly beneath him, the mafia has the underboss and the consigliere, the strategist and the legal mind. Their job is to execute orders efficiently and keep the organization insulated from law enforcement. In the corporate world, these roles are mirrored perfectly by the COO and the general counsel. One runs operations. The other ensures the rules are bent just enough to avoid consequences. But the comparison becomes truly disturbing when we move to the ground level. In the mafia, you have soldiers and capo regimes. These are the earners. Their mandate is simple: extract maximum value from their territory and kick a percentage up the chain. Loyalty is irrelevant if you stop producing. If a soldier stops earning, he's expendable. Now walk onto a Wall Street trading floor. You'll find traders and managing directors operating under the exact same rule: eat what you kill. Your worth is not measured by character, ethics, or teamwork. It's measured by your P&L statement. You fight for territory too. Not street corners, but asset classes, markets, and client lists. Information replaces weapons, but the aggression remains. Fall behind, and you're out. This is not culture by accident. It is survival logic. Now here's where the comparison deepens, because structure alone doesn't explain power. Business models do. The mafia eventually learned something critical in the 1920s. Open warfare is bad for profits. Violence attracts attention. Attention brings consequences. So the families created the commission. They divided territory, fixed prices, resolved disputes internally, and agreed not to encroach on each other's monopolies. They formed a cartel. Wall Street operates on the exact same principle, except they have a far more powerful enforcer than a hitman. They have the government. This is where we confront a truth that makes people uncomfortable. We're taught that regulation exists to protect the public from powerful corporations, that it restrains greed, that it keeps markets fair. But in high finance, regulation often does the opposite. Regulation is not a leash, it's a wall. Think back to Prohibition. By banning alcohol, the government raised the cost of doing business so high that only massive, violent organizations could survive. Small brewers were wiped out. Competition died. Now look at modern banking. After every financial crisis, thousands of pages of new regulations are passed. Compliance requirements explode. Reporting standards multiply. On paper, it looks like punishment. But ask yourself one simple question. Who can afford compliance armies of hundreds of lawyers and auditors? Only the biggest banks. Small community banks, fintech startups, credit unions. They suffocate. They either disappear or get absorbed by the giants. This isn't market failure. This is soft prohibition. Banking isn't illegal, but the entry fee is so high that only cartel members are allowed inside. The fines don't scare them. The compliance costs don't hurt them. These are just maintenance fees to protect territory. This creates a system where power becomes self-reinforcing. When a small business fails, it dies. When a massive bank fails, it gets rescued. Why? Because the state and the institution are now inseparable. The gangster didn't disappear. He became a partner. Risk is socialized. Profit is privatized. This is the ultimate gangster fantasy. A casino where you keep your winnings, but the house covers your losses. Al Capone had to bribe police captains one by one. Wall Street convinced the entire Federal Reserve to underwrite its bets. The tactics of the underworld weren't defeated. They were sanitized, legalized, integrated. The modern gangster doesn't need a gun. He needs a legislative pen. But this raises an even more dangerous question. If power is protected by regulation and monopolies are enforced by the state, how do these institutions ensure the laws always favor them? The answer isn't money alone. It's something far more elegant and far more corrosive. Because to control the game permanently, you don't bribe the sheriff. You become the sheriff. And that's where the story goes next. At this point in the story, we've seen how prohibition creates criminals, how crime creates cash, and how cash forces criminals into the financial system. But now we reach the most important question of all. How does this system survive? How does it operate in plain sight, decade after decade, without collapsing under its own corruption? The answer is not violence. The answer is not secrecy. The answer is something far more elegant and far more dangerous. It's called regulatory capture. This is the moment where the gangster doesn't fight the law anymore. He becomes the law. In the age of Al Capone, corruption was crude. If you wanted protection, you bribed a cop. If you wanted influence, you bribed a politician. It was risky, inefficient, and left fingerprints everywhere. The modern system evolved beyond that. The financial elite realized something profound. You don't need to bribe the regulator if you control who the regulator is. This is the logic of the revolving door. Picture the journey. A smart, ambitious young lawyer joins a government agency, the SEC, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve. Officially, his job is to protect the public, to regulate banks, to prevent fraud. But across the table during investigations, he sees something else. He sees defense attorneys earning 10, 20 times his salary. He sees the future. And a silent calculation begins. He understands that his next job doesn't depend on being aggressive. It depends on being reasonable. It depends on not pushing too hard, on settling instead of prosecuting, on interpreting the rules gently. The bribe is never spoken aloud. It doesn't come in a suitcase of cash. The bribe is the career path itself. Be lenient today. Get rewarded tomorrow. When he finally leaves public service, he doesn't disappear. He's hired by the very institution he once regulated. Vice President of Compliance, Senior Advisor, General Counsel. The watchdog doesn't just fall asleep. It gets fed by the wolf. This changes everything. Because now regulation no longer functions as protection for the public. It functions as insurance for the cartel. And this is where the comparison to the old mafia becomes impossible to ignore. In the 1920s, protection was a racket. You paid the boss so your shop didn't get burned down. In the modern financial system, they call it lobbying. Corporations don't spend billions on politicians out of civic duty. They spend it because it's the highest return investment available. Lobbying is how the cartel writes the rules of the game. Most people believe laws are written by legislators. In reality, many are drafted by lobbyists, handed to politicians, and passed without being fully read. The result is devastatingly efficient. The government becomes the enforcement arm of private interests. When Al Capone wanted to eliminate competition, he sent gunmen. When a major bank wants to eliminate competition, it sends lawyers. A new regulation appears. It's complex, expensive, technically neutral. On paper, it protects consumers. In practice, it destroys startups, crushes fintechs, and suffocates innovation. Only the giants can afford the compliance costs. The competition dies quietly, buried under paperwork. It's a hit job executed with a pen instead of a gun. But here's the most obscene part of the system, the part that separates the old gangster from the modern banker. Risk. In the criminal underworld, there is a brutal honesty. If a gangster makes a bad bet, he pays for it. Prison, death, total ruin. He has skin in the game. Failure is personal and final. Now look at Wall Street. When the architects of the 2008 financial crisis made catastrophic bets that were mathematically doomed, what happened? Did they lose their freedom, their fortunes, their power? No. The state intervened. The losses were socialized. You paid for them. This is the ultimate distortion of capitalism. Profits are private. Losses are public. It's a casino where the house never loses because the government covers the downside. Imagine Al Capone walking into City Hall after a bad shipment and demanding a bailout. He would have been laughed out of the room or shot. Yet this exact logic is now standard policy. Too big to fail is just gangster logic with better branding. This reveals a terrifying truth. The old gangster operated against the law. The modern financial elite operates through the law. They don't break the rules. They rewrite them. And when theft is legalized through legislation, there is no crime scene, no investigation, no justice. The robbery becomes invisible. You only feel it years later, in stagnant wages, inflated assets, and a shrinking middle class. The journey is complete. The bootlegger became the banker. The enforcer became the regulator. The racket became policy. The violence didn't disappear. It was outsourced to the state. The corruption didn't stop. It was sanitized by accounting firms and legal language. And now we have to ask the most dangerous question of all. If this system learned its best tricks from the underworld, if crime didn't disappear but evolved, then are we really living in a lawful society? Or are we living inside the most sophisticated protection racket ever built? Because if history teaches us anything, it's this. Every time a cartel believes it has locked down the system forever, a new disruption emerges from the shadows. And when it does, the cycle begins again. If you think this story ended with Al Capone dying in a prison hospital bed, then you've missed the most important revelation of all. Because history doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in cycles. The faces change. The technology evolves. The commodities shift, from barrels of whiskey to kilos of powder to streams of encrypted data, but the economic machinery underneath never changes. The incentives stay exactly the same. And because the incentives never change, the outcomes don't either. We are not living after Prohibition. We are living through the next version of it. Every era has its forbidden commodity. Every generation has its moral crusade. In the 1920s, it was alcohol. For decades, it was the war on drugs. A war that failed to eliminate addiction, but succeeded spectacularly in creating cartel empires richer than some nation-states. And today, the battlefield has become even more abstract. Look around. Unregulated cryptocurrencies, cross-border capital controls, data, privacy, information, energy, even speech. Every time the state declares war on a market it cannot fully control, it repeats the same mistake. It doesn't destroy demand. It concentrates power. It inflates risk premiums. And it quietly hands the future to whoever is willing to operate in the shadows. This is how new elites are born. And this is where we have to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about old money. We tend to look at dynastic families, political legacies, and philanthropic foundations as symbols of legitimacy, as pillars of civilization. But if you dig deep enough into the origins of almost any massive concentration of wealth, you will often find what I call a great crime buried at the foundation. Not always visible, not always remembered, but always there. This leads us to a concept I call the baptism of time. In the first generation, a man breaks the law. He smuggles. He exploits. He accumulates capital in ways that are morally, and often legally, indefensible. He is labeled a criminal. In the second generation, that money is cleaned, invested, and normalized. It builds real estate, funds businesses, buys influence. The son becomes a respectable businessman. By the third generation, the blood has faded. The origin story has been rewritten. The family name now sits on university buildings, charity galas, and political ballots. The criminal has become an aristocrat. The only thing that changed was time. And we are watching this process happen again, right now, in real time. The controversial crypto baron, the gray market data broker, the offshore capital wizard. Today, they are framed as dangerous, unstable, or irresponsible. But history tells us something else. Give it 1 or 2 generations, their descendants will be senators, central bankers, and moral authorities lecturing the rest of society about responsibility and rules. This brings us to the final synthesis of everything you've seen so far. The gangster and the banker are not enemies. They are not opposites. They are siblings. Both are products of the same force, the interventionist state. The gangster needs prohibition to create scarcity and profit. The corrupt banker needs regulation to eliminate competition and protect monopoly. One operates outside the law. The other rewrites the law. But both extract wealth using the same distortion of power. Every time the state tries to legislate economic morality, to override supply and demand with force, it creates a distortion field. Inside that field, the honest player is crushed and the ruthless player thrives. Crime doesn't disappear, it gets gentrified. Violence moves from the street to the balance sheet. The thug becomes an executive, the racket becomes policy, and the public is left with the illusion of safety, while wealth is quietly siphoned upward. This is the architecture of corruption. It doesn't look like chaos. It looks like order. It doesn't feel like theft. It feels like law. The G-man and the hitman are two sides of the same coin, spinning endlessly through history. And no matter which side lands face up, the house always wins. The most important lesson here isn't about alcohol or Al Capone or even Wall Street. It's about understanding that when power is allowed to pick winners and losers, when it decides what markets may exist and who is allowed to compete, we don't eliminate corruption. We manufacture it. Yesterday, the name was Capone. Today, it's a cartel leader or a financial institution. Tomorrow, it will be something else entirely. Different suits, same math. If this cyclical view of history, this realization that clean power is often just dirty power plus time, has shifted how you see the world, then you're ready for the final step. Because once you can see the game, the real question becomes, how do you avoid being crushed by it? And that's exactly where we're going next. If you're still watching right now, that already tells me something important about you. It means you're not satisfied with the clean, comfortable stories we're taught to believe. You stayed because you sensed there was something underneath the surface, a pattern, a machine, a logic that connects gangsters, bankers, politicians, and power itself. Most people never look this deep, not because they can't, but because once you see the machinery, you can't unsee it. And that's exactly why this channel exists. This wasn't a story about Al Capone. It wasn't really about the mafia, and it definitely wasn't just about history. It was about how power actually works. How laws don't always restrain corruption. Sometimes they design it. How crime doesn't disappear. It evolves. How the most dangerous systems are the ones that no longer look illegal. Once you understand this, the world starts to feel different. News headlines change meaning. Political speeches sound hollow. Financial crises stop looking like accidents and start looking like patterns. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people will never see this perspective. Not because it's hidden, but because it's inconvenient. If this video gave you that shift, even slightly, then subscribing isn't just supporting a channel. It's choosing to stay sharp in a world designed to keep people distracted, emotional, and confused. That button doesn't just notify you of new videos. It puts you inside a small group of people who care about how systems really operate, not how they're marketed. I'm genuinely curious how many of you made it all the way through this investigation. If you're still here, drop the comment, "No more illusions," below. Not for the algorithm, but so we know who actually stayed awake until the end. Now this story doesn't stop here. Understanding the gangster is one thing. Understanding the system that manufactures him is another. There's a video on your screen right now that takes this logic even further, showing how these same mechanisms operate in today's financial world, in ways that affect your money, your work, and your future, far more directly than most people realize. Click on it. Let's keep pulling the thread, because the moment you stop questioning the system is the moment the system wins.